Hi there. It's May the 30th, and we're continuing our progress through the Good News of John, and we're reading from chapter 18, verse 25, through to chapter 19, verse 22. So we are in the thick of the unfolding events leading up to the crucifixion of Jesus. We left Peter yesterday warming himself in the courtyard at the high priest's house and being challenged by a young woman there whether he was a follower of Jesus, and he said no. Now he's challenged again by someone else because they recognize that he's one of the band who was with Jesus. Again, he denies it. Then someone else recognizes him, and this is really pushing him into a corner because this person is a relative of a servant of the high priest whose ear Peter had cut off. So now Peter is in danger of being identified as a violent criminal, and so immediately he defends himself and he denies any knowledge of Jesus, and it's at that point the cock crows. It's a very interesting way that John has of seeing this. John puts the context here. In one sense, we can understand Peter's covering up so that he doesn't entrap himself, he doesn't incriminate himself, but in doing so he's done the very thing Jesus said he would do. The scene then switches to the scene with Pilate. Pilate is the governor, the Judean governor, before whom the high priests and the leaders of the Jews bring Jesus because they cannot bring a death sentence. Only the Roman governors can bring a death sentence. So they take Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the praetorium, but because it's the preparation time for the Passover, the priests and the leaders don't want to damage themselves or to make themselves unclean for the Passover, so they won't go into the praetorium. So Pilate instead comes out and speaks to them, and he says, what is it that this man's done? What's his crime? Now, they don't actually state a crime. They basically ask Pilate to take it on trust. They say, if he hadn't been guilty of something, we wouldn't have brought him to you. Pilate then goes in and he then begins to question Jesus and says, are you a king? Jesus says, well, I am, but I'm not a king of this world. He says, if I was a king like the kings of this world, my followers would have fought for me. They would have defended me. My kingdom is not of this world. Now, imagine Pilate in this situation thinks he's dealing initially with a madman perhaps, but as he talks with Jesus, Jesus really gets under his skin, and Pilate starts to doubt in himself, or he starts to question in himself what's going on. And so Jesus speaks about being the evidence, the witness to the truth, and Pilate and says quite cynically, oh, what is truth? As if truth can be known, but not realizing that the one who embodies truth, Aletheia, stands right in front of him. And he goes back out. Now Pilate is beginning to get a bit disgruntled, a bit uncertain. He goes back out to the Jews and he says, I'm not finding anything to accuse this man of. We're just having a philosophical discussion here. But they say, no, he needs to be dealt with. So Pilate thinks of another solution, a way out of this. He says, look, usually at Passover, I release someone to you as a show of clemency, as an act of goodwill. Who shall I release to you? Can I release to you this one, the king of the Jews? And they shout, no, release to us Barabbas, Barabbas. Now, Barabbas is an interesting symbol here because Barabbas, his name in Aramaic, means son of the father. And so they are demanding a wrongdoer who happens to carry the name of the son of the father, but the real son of the father they want to condemn to death. Pilate now thinks, okay, well, if I punish him, maybe I can get him out that way. So he has Jesus flogged. They put a crown of thorns on him, sharp crowns that would have gone down into his forehead. They put a robe of purple on him. They mock him and they hit him. And then they take him out and they say, Pilate says, look, here is the man. He's just a man. In fact, is what he's saying. Ideo anthropos. Here he is, look, he's just a man. But they all begin to shout, crucify him, stavroson, crucify him. And Pilate is now really worried because he realizes that there's a mob growing here. And they say he's undermined Caesar. He's undermining Caesar. And of course, when they begin to say that, Pilate knows that if news of this gets back to Caesar, if there's a possibility of this man undermining Caesar's authority, then Pilate himself is in trouble. And so eventually Pilate yields to this quote-unquote people's choice, this decision of the people, and he gives Jesus over to be crucified totally unjustly, totally against Roman law and procedure, because Jesus has not been convicted of anything deserving death, but Pilate yields to this mob rule. He yields to this people's choice, as it were, and he gives him over. So they take Jesus away from this point to the place we know so familiarly, Golgotha, the place of the skull, the place of the it was probably called that because it looked like a skull. It was probably a place of common place of execution. But Pilate here is determined to have the last word, and he writes a titulus, a banner to go over the head of Jesus, and he makes really clear that everyone can understand, because he writes it in Hebrew or in Aramaic, in Greek, and in Latin, and it basically says, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. And when the Jews see this, they are incensed, because this is not what they wanted to see, and they complain to Pilate. They say, don't write he's the King of the Jews, right? He said he's the King of the Jews. And Pilate, in the last lines of this reading, he says in Greek, "O yegrapha, yegrapha, what I have written, I have written." It's Pilate having the last say, in sense, in this political battle between Rome and Israel, where Rome is yielding to the Israelite leaders, but actually they're both in cahoots at the death of Jesus, the innocent man. They're both in cahoots in corruption and injustice against him. And Pilate kind of makes this known to the whole world for all of history, that here, this is the reason Jesus has been crucified, is because he's claiming to be, and of course is, the King of the Jews. Terrible things that Jesus goes through here. We see the people's choice. We see what happens when people act against God, when people act against the will of God, and they band together and they move against what God wants. It ends in injustice, it ends in inequality, it ends in enmity, it ends in death. But Jesus is bearing this. Jesus knows that all this is going to happen as he stands before Pilate, the one who asks what is truth. He stands before us as the truth, as the one who is embodied truth, and whom when we follow, we truly follow. We are following God himself. Have a very good May the 30th.